Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back from wherever you are in the world. It is myself and Jimmy again, and the Adventures in Historyland YouTube channel talking about 1812. And although we have finished the general narrative, the general story, we still have bonus material for you. So don't be too sad.
Yes.
Today, we're talking about legacy.
In the course of this video, we'll be talking about what happened to a lot of these Russian generals in 1812, their fates, their relationship to Russian history over the course of the next 40, 50 years, and how they were remembered in Russia at that time.
And in doing so, we will chart a great span of Russian history that will show you the significance that 1812 had, in a way, on the rest of the world, because it shaped a lot of the careers of these people.
In our discussion of the generals, I feel like we haven't really given a proper send-off to some of the senior generals who have sadly perished during the 1812 and the later campaigns. And obviously at the very head of them is Prince Kutuzov, who, as I've mentioned before, he died in April 1813 in what is now modern-day Poland. He died at Vilnius, and his body was brought back to St. Petersburg, where it had a grandiose state funeral at the Kazan Cathedral.
A larger-than-life resting place for a larger-than-life figure.
That is very true. And another larger-than-life figure is General Bagration. Now, as we know, he was fatally wounded during the Battle of Borodino, defending the Semyonovsky flèches. And he lingered on for another 3 weeks, and he was evacuated beyond Moscow to the village of Sima in Vladimir province. And that's where he was buried. But in 1839, his remains were transferred to the Borodino battlefield and placed at the foot of the main monument on the Great Redoubt, the Ravsky Redoubt, which was also inaugurated at the same time. So we go on now to another person who was buried on the Borodino battlefield, and this was Dmitry Neverovsky. Now, we know Neverovsky as the guy who was almost always, during the Second Army's retreat, at the front lines. He fought at Smolensk. He fought at Borodino on the flèches, and he later served in the 1813 campaign. And it was during this campaign at the Battle of Leipzig where he was killed on the final day, or mortally wounded on the final day. And he was initially buried in the German city of Halle. But in 1912, the centenary of the 1812 campaign, his remains were transferred onto the Borodino battlefield and buried in a grave in the left flèche, where he and his 27th Division fought. And his grave is, in fact, just on a direct line behind the monument to the 27th Division. So now we've dealt with the Russian generals who have died during the 1812, 13, and indeed the 14 and 15 campaigns. Not much happened in 1815. So Barclay became Prince Barclay de Tolly in 1815, and he remained commander-in-chief of the Russian army for the remainder of his life. He, in 1816, or around then, he actually witnessed the first test of rockets in the Russian army. In the Artillery Museum in St. Petersburg, there is a small section which talks about the beginnings of rocket technology in the Russian army, and how Barclay de Tolly had overseen that. And I think he basically wrote that this is promising technology, but it needs to be tested.
But the Vostok starts here.
And another interesting bit of information, especially for the Americans out there, about Barclay de Tolly, is that in 1816, some Russians ended up in Hawaii, and they set up 3 forts, which were named after Alexander, Elizabeth, the Empress, the Tsar's wife, and the 3rd fort was named Fort Barclay de Tolly. But just to finish the story on Barclay de Tolly, he's been suffering from ill health for quite a while, since 1815, and he keeps asking Alexander for leave to restore his health. Alexander finds him too important and never grants him the leave until early 1818, but by that time it's already too late, as Barclay, while on his way with his family to Germany in order to seek a cure, he dies in the Prussian town of Insterburg, which is now Chernihovsk in Kaliningrad Oblast in Russia. So after Barclay died, his body was brought back to what was the Russian Empire at the time, and the Tsar wanted to bury him in the Kazan Cathedral and give him a grand funeral as Kutuzov had, but Barclay's wishes were to be buried at his estate, which was then called Bekhov, which is now called Jurgeviste in southern Estonia. So to carry on with our tour of the legacies of the Russian generals, we come to our good friend, the guy we like to hate, General Bienikson. He was still among the elite of the Russian army at this time, and he commanded the Russian Second Army until 1818. He retires due to ill health and returns to his estate in Germany, and he dies in 1826. We now move on to Dmitry Doktorov, the 6th Corps commander in the 1812 campaign, and he participated in the 1815 campaign and commanded the right wing of the Russian army as it made its way to France, although it didn't do much. But early 1816, he left the army due to illness, and he died in November that year. We move on to one of our favorite people, the dashing Cossack, Matvey Platov. So something to say about Platov, actually, is that in 1814, a lot of the senior Russian generals accompanied Tsar Alexander to visit London, along with the other Allied powers.
Blucher was there, and
that's right. The Prussians with Blucher and Gneisenau and co, and also with the Prussians, King Frederick Wilhelm was there. With the Austrians,
nobody really paid attention to him. So.
This is true. With the Austrians, the Emperor Francis did not make the journey, but Metternich did, and also Schwarzenberg and some of the other senior Austrian command.
They were all put in the shade, however, by the dazzling tiara that was Tsar Alexander and his Russian
Yes.
generals.
And especially, yeah, Alexander himself was feted as the savior of Europe, and he was given a lot of publicity, let's say. But also, the Cossacks had basically taken Europe by storm, and all the Londoners wanted to get a glimpse of them. Apparently, the Cossacks bivouacked at Hyde Park. So yeah, a lot of Cossack mania, basically.
They did. They started fashions and all sorts of things, and Platov was fated high amongst all the Russian generals there.
Yeah, a lot of Cossack memorabilia is produced, and he was actually, and this is rather, you could say, astonishing for a Cossack. He was awarded an honorary doctorate of law from the University of Oxford, I believe together with the Tsar. So they were the first Russians to be given honorary doctorates by Oxford.
And I believe he dedicated some of the rest of his later life actually to education when he went back to how do you say it?
Novichokhovsk.
Yeah.
so yes,
and his portraits in the Waterloo Gallery in Windsor Castle.
Yeah, by Thompson. But just a word on Novichokhovsk. It was the new capital city of the Don Cossacks, founded by Platov in 1805. Basically, the old capital city was slightly too close to the River Don, and it flooded rather frequently. So he moved it to slightly higher ground, in a place which he called Novichokhovsk, and he continued with sort of building the city, and he died in 1818, and he is buried in the Resurrection Cathedral at Novichokhovsk. And another interesting thing also associated with this trip to London is that he was one of 4 generals to be awarded a special golden sword by the City of London Corporation, and Platov's sword is currently on display at the Don Cossack Museum in Novichokhovsk. We continue to his buddy.
Yeah, right-hand man.
On his
his sidekick.
on his famous raid on the French left during the Battle of Borodino, who is, of course, Fyodor Uvarov, then the commander of the 1st Cavalry Corps.
A very striking-looking fellow from his portraits.
Uvarov actually was quite close to Tsar Alexander, and he was appointed adjutant general. In fact, the senior adjutant general. So he accompanies Alexander on various congresses across Europe. And in 1821, he was appointed commander of the Guard Corps. And 1823, he was elevated to the State Council, but he dies in 1824. And he is buried, I believe, in the Alexander Nevsky Lavra, which is a monastic site to the east of St. Petersburg, where Alexander Nevsky is buried, and where Suvorov is buried.
That's august company in terms of Russian history, all right.
Yeah. So we now move on to Piotr Wittgenstein, who had already once been commander-in-chief of the Allied army following Kutuzov's death, but only for a short period, because he lost the battles of Lutzen and Bautzen and rescinded his command to Barclay de Tolly. He also spends a bit of time as commander of the Second Army. I believe he replaces Bennigsen in 1818. And from August 1826, he becomes Field Marshal. And I believe this is in relation to the coronation of Tsar Nicholas I. And in 1828, he is appointed commander-in-chief of the Russian army in the war against the Ottomans. And which lasted from 1828 to 29, but ill health soon caused him to retire. He died in what was then called Lemberg, which is now called Lviv in Ukraine, in 1843. And now we actually move on to the Tsar himself. What happened to Tsar Alexander?
Not a small subject, the Tsar himself.
Yes. So we are planning to actually go through his post-Napoleonic career pretty quickly.
Mm.
So on the realm of foreign policy, so as a result of the Congress of Vienna, the Congress system is set up, and Alexander is one of the main instigators of this, and together with Lord Castlereagh, the British Foreign Secretary. And essentially what the Congress system is a way for the great powers of Europe to get together and sit down and discuss any major crisis that's going on in Europe at the time, or indeed further afield. And it's essentially a way for them to keep the peace. And there were 4 of these congresses in the decade after Vienna, and all of these Tsar Alexander participated in. In terms of domestic policy, or really in terms of actually Tsar Alexander's personality, because historians consider Tsar Alexander to have come through basically some sort of spiritual reawakening during the Napoleonic Wars, and especially in 1812. And supposedly he became a lot more spiritual and a lot more religious. And in fact, he's known to history as Alexander the Blessed. So he devoted a lot more of his time to religious and spiritual affairs. One of the key policies instituted by Alexander following the Napoleonic Wars was a policy called military colonies, which was essentially it was actually intended as a rather progressive way to demobilize the massive army which had been built up. They weren't very popular. Soldiers didn't want to be peasants.
As we said in a previous episode, the difference between a peasant and a soldier was very great in Russia, and it meant an awful lot.
It was very great, to the extent that while initially a soldier may have been a peasant to begin his life, once he became a soldier, becoming a peasant again was not a smooth transition. Let's put it that way. So it wasn't particularly popular, and you had a series of mutinies, actually, including the Semyonovsky Guards who had mutiny as a result of one of these being put in one of these military colonies. But in any case, so these are the sort of main policies associated with Tsar Alexander in the second half of his reign. In 1825, he joins his wife, who is rather ill at this point. They go to southern Russia and they visit various places, but they're based in Taganrog. Alexander died at the end of the year with what is officially called malaria, although the circumstances of his death, or otherwise, are disputed. But officially, let's say, Tsar Alexander died at the end of 1825, which leads us to his younger brother and the heir to the throne for much of this, Grand Duke Constantine Pavlovich. Who we have met before as a very strong critic of Barclay de Tolly, and basically always telling Barclay to get lost, with varying degrees of success, let's say. After the Napoleonic Wars, Constantine is appointed commander of the Polish army in 1815, and this is where we need to say a few words about Poland, which is that the Congress of Vienna established Poland as a separate entity connected to the Russian crown. And Alexander, being de jure king of Poland, was certainly not in Poland for much of his time. So instead, he essentially left his brother there as his deputy. It was in 1823 when he marries a Polish woman, Countess Grudzinska. And this is a morganatic marriage, which means that he married below his station.
Absolutely legal necessity for someone of his rank in that time.
Right. He did not marry a royal, and therefore he was officially barred from the succession. And Alexander writes to him and basically asks him, "Are you going to renounce the throne?" And Constantine says, "Yes, I didn't really want it anyway." And Alexander produces a secret manifesto to this end, but very few people are actually aware of it. Right? Maybe 3 people at most, not including Constantine himself, or indeed the person who would succeed the throne in his absence, his younger brother, Nikolai Pavlovich. So, when Alexander dies in 1825, rather suddenly in Taganrog, no one expects it. News reaches Petersburg, and immediately Constantine is proclaimed Tsar. Knowledge of this manifesto did not come to light before everyone had already been told to pledge allegiance to Constantine. The people who know about it, including Alexander Golitsyn, who was essentially the Tsar Alexander's spiritual advisor, he basically says, "By the way, the Tsar had entrusted us with this manifesto, which says that Nicholas is meant to succeed the throne."
It sounds fishy.
Right.
If you're hearing it just as sort of a Russian nobleman,
and
knowing the history of Russia,
if you're hearing it for the first time, and given so few people know about it, it sounds like someone is trying to stage a coup or something. And so they just wait a bit, and they send word to Warsaw, which is where Constantine is, and they ask, "We believe you have renounced the throne, but do you want it?"
You want it anyway.
and he basically sends a message back saying, "No, God save Tsar Nicholas." So the message is received in St. Petersburg, and troubles happen. So rather than becoming Tsar, Constantine remains in Poland, and he's now actually officially made Viceroy of Poland until his death from the cholera epidemic in 1831, which is a phrase you'll be hearing on more than one occasion in this episode.
Interestingly, he survived an assassination attempt, I believe, the year before during the November uprising. Very
closely connected with Constantine is the fate of Mikhail Miloradovich, the Russian Murat, as
you may recall.
He's appointed commander of the Guards in 1815, and a few years later, in 1818, he is appointed Governor General of St. Petersburg. In this capacity, he bumps into Alexander Pushkin, who is known as Russia's greatest poet. At this time, he was engaged in some sort of seditious poetry. He was being questioned, basically, and Miloradovich interrogated him about his seditious verses. He had burned all the suspicious papers and poems, but during his interview with Miloradovich, he voluntarily recited all of them from memory. Miloradovich, being the sort of person he was, basically thought, "What a chivalrous gentleman," and let him off very lightly indeed, and essentially, sent him on a paid visit to southern Russia. Pushkin was technically exiled. Russia, one of the only countries in the world where you can be exiled to Russia. In 1825, which is the year of Alexander's death, and during the succession crisis, Miloradovich played a crucial role as governor of St. Petersburg. And in fact, what he did was essentially assume dictatorial powers during the interregnum. And after news came back of Constantine's refusal, you had maybe 3 or 4 days when St. Petersburg was in political turmoil, because you had some stuff going on in other parts of Russia.
Some things have coincided in the grand tapestry of Russian history, that a bubbling undercurrent of unrest, you might call it, brought back, some say, from the wars with France into the through certain army officers and cliques and clubs and back rooms that at this point come to the surface.
Yes. As a result of spending some time in Paris, several junior officers in the Russian army basically thought, hang on, life is actually not too bad here. And people have like civil rights and stuff. Wow, like, that's incredible. Like, and it's not only us nobles who get to enjoy them. And they were very impressed, essentially, by the fruits of the French Revolution, which had, to some extent, been carried on under Napoleon and not completely reversed following the Bourbon Restoration. And they came back to Russia and thought, hey, wouldn't it be a good idea to make something like this happen in Russia? Now, there were actually constitutional reform ideas in Russia. In 1818, there was a constitutional project for the whole of the Russian Empire, but that was shelved and nothing came of it. So these rather idealistic army officers basically started congregating and gathering in these secret societies. Had one main one in the north and one main one in the south, called respectively the Northern Society and the Southern Society.
Umbrella of, I believe they called themselves the Union of Salvation or something like that.
That's right. The Northern Society tended to be a bit more moderate. The Southern Society tended to be more radical. And these societies were planning to essentially kill the Tsar and take over. Their initial target had been Tsar Alexander. Now, at the end of 1825, they think that the succession crisis is a good opportunity to set the wheels of this coup in motion. So this is what happens, the Decembrist uprising. Now, the Southern Society, the people in the Southern Society, it's too far away, and actually, on the eve of the rising, some senior members of the society are already arrested. In the north, it's a more volatile situation. Essentially, on the day that Nicholas I is supposed to be proclaimed Tsar, you have a gathering of, say, maybe 3,000 Russian officers and men on Senate Square, and they announce that they're not going to swear an oath to Tsar Nicholas. Instead, they believe that Constantine is the rightful Tsar.
They actually have a slogan that they shout, which is Constantine and the Constitution and things like that.
Right. So in Russian, Konstantin and Konstitucja. They were essentially making hay of the situation, because Constantine was actually not a particularly liberal person.
Great irony that this should be the rallying cry of these reformists.
Indeed.
Yeah. So this is what General Miloradovich has got to deal with right now, and he flaps around a little. Goes to see the news. I believe some of the Imperial Guard have just been sworn in to loyalty to Nicholas that morning. And so those are the troops on hand, and he promises the Tsar he's going to go and deal with the situation.
And Miloradovich decides in his, again, very much like Murat, a lot of bravery, but not a lot of brains.
You know, he loves to talk to people. He seems to think he has some sort of electrifying personality. So he feels his aura will overwhelm these rebellious troops.
I mean, to be fair, he does.
Yeah, he does.
He does. But sometimes even that is not enough. So essentially he tells his men to stay behind, and he promises, because he wants to sort this thing out sort of without bloodshed and peacefully. he probably knows some of these guys.
Yeah.
So he just wants to have a chat, try to come to some sort of agreement to get them to stand down. Unfortunately, with rebels, they can be a bit rebellious, and they don't always do what you expect them to do.
Yeah, it's not a very united front out there. There are people believing several versions of what they're doing. Some of them are diehard revolutionaries who I believe call themselves the Grenadiers, and some of them are just wanting simple reform, and some of them are who knows what they're there for. But you cannot depend on them all doing the same thing.
Right. So Milorادович goes among the Decembrists and tries to find someone to talk to. It's unclear whether he's on horseback or whether he's on foot, but in either sense, it doesn't stop a guy called Pyotr Kakhovsky from shooting him, and another guy called Prince Yevgeny Obolensky from stabbing him after he's been shot. And while Milorádovich remained conscious for a while, he died later that day. So that is the sad demise.
A very tragic end for a soldier like Milorádovich to be shot down and bayoneted by troops he probably served with.
Yeah, and this was actually, a rather unpopular thing that the Decembrists did, because a lot of the men did.
Cut a long story short, Tsar Nicholas turns up himself, and he loves to do parade ground maneuvers, and he brings his artillery up.
Yeah.
And clears the square. There's a bit before this as well. There's an embarrassing cavalry charge and all sorts of stuff, but the end is artillery fire and cavalry sabers.
He learns from Napoleon himself, from his example 30 years ago, and he gives the Decembrists a whiff of grape shot. And
that is the salute over Miloradovich's great body, sort of.
Yes, indeed. And someone who was connected, though certainly not part of them, was General Nikolai Raevsky. Now, in his youth, he had been more of a liberal, but his young sons, who we've met before at Satanovka, Alexander and Nikolai, they initially joined the Southern Society, although by the time the Decembrist rebellion happens, they have already left. But this is not the end of the Raevsky's associations with the Decembrists, because Nikolai, the senior Nikolai, the general, his daughter Maria Raevskaya, who is also associated with Pushkin, actually, and it should be mentioned that during Pushkin's southern sojourn, he actually befriends General Raevsky and his sons, and indeed his daughter. And she was a bit too young for a physical relationship, even given Pushkin's track record. But she inspired several of Pushkin's verses. She ended up marrying Prince Sergei Volkonsky, who remained a member of the society, and in fact was the only general who was still a member of the societies. And General Sergei Volkonsky was initially sentenced to death, but later the sentence was commuted to exile or hard labor, katorga as the Russians call it, in Siberia. And Maria petitioned to join her husband alongside actually several other women who were wives of the Decembrists. And these petitions were granted by the Tsar, and they were allowed to join them and join in their fate, their suffering. These Decembrist wives were particularly celebrated for their loyalty and devotion to their husbands. General Nikolai Raevsky himself, he was rather heartbroken by the fact that his beloved daughter had gone off to join husband in exile, and he died in 1829, not too long after it happened.
I think he was on the way to actually petition the Tsar to overturn the permission for her to go. I think.
Yes, I think he tried to sort of travel to Petersburg to do that. Now we move on to Mikhail Vorontsov. We spoke of him as the commander of the Combined Grenadier Division in 1812. And he saw action both at the fight for the Shovadino redoubt and in the main battle of Borodino, where he was wounded rather heavily, actually. And it wasn't several months after when he could return in 1813 and join the campaign. And and after the successful campaign, he commanded the Allied Corps of Occupation from 1815 to 1818, and he was and after a while, he was then appointed Governor General of New Russia. So he was based in Odessa, which is now obviously in Ukraine, and that is, if you've never been, which I haven't, but if you see pictures of Odessa, it's an absolutely beautiful city, neoclassical architecture. Vorontsov is he's responsible for much of that, including the Potemkin Steps, which sort of is a massive staircase leading to the Black Sea, and he is also associated with the life of Alexander Pushkin in Russia, because in southern Russia, he's Pushkin's host. He treats him very well. Pushkin basically has an affair with his wife.
Okay.
That's fine with it. But that did not stop Pushkin from mocking Vorontsov majorly in a lot of his verses. And one of my favorites is just a short 4-line quatrain, which I will attempt to recite in Russian. Polumilo, polukupец, полумудрец, полуневежда, полуподлец, но есть надежда, что будет полным наконец. Now, for all of you who are not Russian and do not speak Russian, let me translate for you. So, half an aristocrat, half a noble, half a merchant, half a wise man, half an idiot, half a scoundrel. But there is hope that he'll become a full one eventually. Nevertheless, he later on was sent to command the army in the Caucasus in 1844. Now, Russia had been involved in conflict against Caucasian tribes for almost a 50-year period from around sort of the 1810s to the 1860s. And it's not so much on-stop, but it's sort of stop and go, and there are always various border conflicts. And in 1844, Vorontsov is sent there and wins several victories over Imam Shamil, who is the leader of the Circassians. And as a result, he is given the title of Serene Prince in 1852, so the same dignity as Kutuzov. But ill health soon forced him to retire from the army. And while he was promoted to Field Marshal in 1856, in connection to Alexander II's coronation, he died a couple of months later. And moving on to Vorontsov, we have another general who also spent a bit of time in the Caucasus. And this is Alexei Yermolov, who we know as the chief of staff of the Russian First Army, who plotted against Barclay on several occasions, later co-leading that famous charge around the Great Redoubt at Borodino.
And artillery commander in 1813 and 14 at the Battle of Kulm and things like that.
Yeah, and I think he commanded the Guard Reserve at Leipzig, if I'm not mistaken.
I think so.
So Yermolov, has been in several senior positions, and actually, he reconciles with Barclay over the course of the 1813 and 14 campaigns. He recognizes the genius of Barclay's strategy. After the successful campaign in 1812, he could see how sort of foresighted Barclay was. But in any case, Yermolov is sent to the Caucasus in 1816, and he exerts formidable authority over that part of Russia, and he does quite a lot of work building up the infrastructure, including the Georgian military road, which sort of leads from the Russian side of the border across to what is now Georgia and Tbilisi. And he also sets up a number of fortresses, or strengthens a number of fortresses in the area. But he wasn't able, despite his formidable authority and his draconian measures, to successfully prosecute the war. So in 1827, he was recalled. And from what I've read, he spent the remainder of his career serving in the state council, so a senior civil post. But he didn't return to military matters. But he lived for a very long time, and he died in 1861 at the age of 84, I believe, in Moscow. And he's one of the few senior Russian generals I can find of whom there is photographic evidence. So we now move on to another staff officer, or another person who was a staff officer in 1812, and that is Hans Karl von Diebitsch, or the Russians called him Ivan Diebitsch. And he was appointed adjutant general of Alexander, and was very close to both Alexander and Nicholas, and joined Alexander in the congresses around Europe. And he, being close to Nicholas, he participated in the suppression of the Decembrist revolt and in the trial of the Decembrists afterwards. And he distinguished himself in the Russo-Turkish War of 1828 and 29, which saw him promoted to Field Marshal, and he was given the title of Zabalkansky, or Beyond the Balkans. He was then, so at this point, he was basically the senior general in the Russian army. So in November 1830, when the Polish uprising happens, he is then sent to command the army to suppress the Polish uprising, and he wins a victory, rather major victory, at the Battle of Ostrolenka at the end of May, but died of cholera soon afterwards in 1831, to be replaced by Ivan Paskevich.
This part of what we're talking about, this part of the discussion, could actually be summed up in terms of Russian history by him. And so all the people we're going to talk about after him are going to be fairly simple to talk about, because everything that they do, Paskevich, has something to do with.
So Paskevich is he is essentially the epitome of the reign of Nicholas I, both in military and also in civil terms. So he's very close to the imperial family, and in 1820 he is appointed commander of a guards division, in which serves Nicholas Pavlovich, and Nicholas calls Paskevich father commander throughout his life, throughout his reign. So in 1826, after being involved in the trial of the Decembrists, Paskevich is sent to the Caucasus to essentially keep an eye on what Yermolov is up to. And there is a bit of a sort of, their commands kind of overlap, because Paskevich is given a more direct command, let's say, but Yermolov is still the commander-in-chief, the supreme commander for that sector. And the two men do not get on. And even though Yermolov is such a massive figure his sort of personality and authority extends so far in the Caucasus. He is recalled in 1827, as we have said beforehand, and Paskevich basically gets full authority. And as a result of that, Paskevich is able to gain victory in the war against Persia. So as a result of these incursions with the Caucasus, the Persians get involved. There's a war in 1826, and that goes on for a couple of years. The Russians defeat the Persians in 1828 under Paskevich, and he's promoted to Field Marshal for his victory, and also awarded the victory title of Count of Yerevan, the capital of modern-day Armenia. And in 1832, and we have to remind you here that Grand Duke Constantine had also died from the cholera pandemic. In 1832, Paskevich is now appointed Viceroy of Poland, succeeding Constantine, and pursues a policy of Russification, which makes him very unpopular among the native Polish population. And during this time, he's effectively the senior Russian commander and as I said, the epitome of the reign of Nicholas I, which lasts a good 30 years. And as part of this, Paskevich is sent to lead the Russian forces sent into Hungary in 1848-49 to help suppress the Hungarian uprising. So 1848, some of you may know, is a major year in European history. You have a lot of revolutions happening all across Europe, whether it's in France, in Italy, in Austria,
Spain possibly too,
right, and indeed in Hungary, with the Austrians trying to sort of keep control in Austria. They ask for some Russian assistance, which is readily given by Tsar Nicholas in the form of a 150,000-man army under Paskevich. And the uprising is fairly easily suppressed, and Paskevich goes home back to Poland. And he then, this is a few years later, about 5 years later, Paskevich is once again sent back into the field, and he commands the Danube army in what would be the Crimean War. Essentially, it started off as another Russo-Turkish war. And Russia was trying to expand its influence in the Balkans, trying hopefully to find its way all the way across the straits to take Constantinople, which has been an objective of Muscovite and Russian policy ever since the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The British and the French are not particularly happy with how this may upset the balance of power in Europe.
Yes. The Turkish are very weak at this point, and they think they won't be able to stand up against the Russians.
We have the situation, the British and French want to, they believe that Russia will be too powerful if they defeat the Ottomans another time. So they decide to intervene on behalf of the Ottomans, or alongside the Ottomans. And they do so by essentially landing troops on the Crimean Peninsula and threatening Russia's Black Sea Fleet.
Which is the objective. They don't want Russian ships eventually to be harbored in Constantinople. Simplistically, that's the problem. But the Crimean War is a very big subject in itself. It brings together a very sad reunion of Napoleonic veterans all fighting each other on different sides. Although the French are still fighting the Russians, the British are now allied with the French.
So Paskevich himself, he manages to serve as commander for several months, but in 1854, during the siege of Silistria, he is wounded, and he, as a result of ill health, he returns to Warsaw, and He eventually dies in 1856, and that is pretty much actually the end of the major
the role of honor,
the role of the senior Russian generals in 1812. But obviously, in the Crimean War, there are several more junior officers who, as Josh mentioned, had served at Borodino and Leipzig and so on, who were, while the British and the Russians never really fought together during the Napoleonic Wars, really, they were fighting on the same side.
They were. There was a little bit of interplay. You had people like Robert Wilson,
Yes.
and interestingly, General George Cathcart, who was killed at the Battle of Inkerman, was an aide-de-camp to his father, who was ambassador to Russia in 1813, and he fought at Waterloo as well.
In the Russian army, you've got Prince Menshikov, who is commander-in-chief of the Russians in the Crimea, and he's early in his career he served on Alexander I's staff, and he sort of accompanied him around Europe, the congresses, and I believe he was probably in London actually.
Probably so, yeah. There's a lot of connections between the Napoleonic Wars and the Crimean War, but of interest as we close, a legacy of the Napoleonic Wars in the Crimea is a man named Vasily Kochakov, which I believe I mentioned in the very first episode. A very old man who served with General Tuchkov down at Utitsa at Battle of Borodino in the Grenadier Division. And he had served all the way through all of these events that we just talked about, especially in the Caucasus. He got wounded dozens of times, grew to a very old age, and would be the last surviving Russian infantry soldier, possibly the last Russian soldier to die, that served in the 1812 campaign. And he served apparently in the militia during the siege of Sevastopol.
It's very important you mention someone like Kochakov, because in this episode we've talked about the fates of several Russian generals, the senior Russian generals of 1812, and it's right that they live on in the history books and in paintings and monuments across Russian cities and indeed beyond Russia. But we should also take a moment to pay tribute to the hundreds and thousands of Russian rank-and-file soldiers whose names, unlike Kochakov, are completely forgotten to us. They fought and died at Smolensk, at Borodino, Maloyaroslavets, and Leipzig, and all the other battles in the 1812 to 1815 campaigns, which led to Napoleon's downfall. Around 250,000 Russian soldiers were killed or wounded in the 1812 campaign alone. And the fates of those who survived are mostly forgotten. But without them, Russia would not have defeated Napoleon in 1812, and nor would the Allies have been able to enter Paris in 1814. The world would have been a different place without them. Perhaps for the better, perhaps for the worse. But they fought and died bravely for God, Tsar, and the Russian fatherland, and their collective exploits should not be forgotten.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where we will leave this episode, with the thought of all those brave serf infantrymen, cavalrymen, artillerymen, engineers, and all support Cossacks and
medics,
surgeons, militiamen, partisans, ordinary civilians caught up in the tide of war, the numbers of who died are lost to history because they're in the tens of thousands. And we thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed it. From me and Jimmy, it's
goodbye, but until
the next time.
next bonus episode.
Indeed. How do they say it in Russia? До свидания.
До свидания.